Everyone should look at this chart to know the generation he belongs to and to understand his role in the Nigerian project. Let's start with the baby boomers. These guys are the most active in Nigeria in terms of politics. They call the shots. They have refused to let go. In fact, they will never let go except the younger generation fight back and take their country from them. The generation experienced independence. They grew up even before independence. They experienced the oppression. The economy wasn't all that huge by the time. They also experienced the 60s when Nigeria was projected to grow bigger than China in a few decades if the First Republic politicians stayed in power for much longer. This generation also experienced the Nigerian golden years of the 70s, especially during the oil windfall of the 70s, when Gowon said that Nigeria's problem is not money, but how to spend it. In the 70s, a Nigerian could travel to virtually every country in the world on free visa. The few countries he needed visas for, they were all visa on arrival. A Nigerian didn't need to inform the authorities of any country before boarding a plane. All he needed was to buy his ticket. Upon arrival, if it's a country where he requires visa, that visa will be issued to him at the airport. He will simply be asked, "How long do you want to stay, mister?" And he will say, "Oh, just 2 weeks." And he will be stamped 90 days. Why? Because they know Nigerians are rich. They are heavy spenders. The more they spend time in their country, the more their economy benefits. At the time, the naira was trading blows with the pound. The dollar was definitely below the naira in terms of value. Compare that to what is obtainable today. A Nigerian is required to obtain a visa in Nigeria before traveling to the country. We all know the process of obtaining a visa today. In fact, many Nigerians that belong to the Gen Z can never travel except through education. They all know how to search for scholarships abroad. When they get that, they start filing their documents at the embassy and eventually they are awarded a visa. They will now travel as students. Even getting a tourist visa in Nigeria is very difficult. What changed? The economy took a hit. In the 70s, many foreigners were schooling in Nigerian universities. Our education used to have a very high standard comparable to European universities. But all that has changed. Nigerians now troop abroad to study in foreign universities. In fact, Nigerians are subjected to English tests before they can be admitted to foreign universities. Despite studying English from childhood, in fact, most Nigerians speak English so well, better than Englishmen. But they are still subjected to English tests before they can be granted admission. Now to the real value of the naira in the 70s. Many young people that belong to the Generation Z have never seen one kobo, not to talk of understanding the value it had in the 70s. For example, one kobo could buy a lot of snacks, chewing gums, agidi, puff-puff. One kobo is usually given to students at the time when they go to school. So you can understand the value it had. 1 naira could buy many cups of garri at the time. Remember that as at 70s, Nigeria's minimum wage was 130 naira. That 130 naira could take a lot of workers home and they will still have savings. A family of 4 could feed on just 50 naira groceries for 1 month. So you can understand the value the naira had in the 70s. Now enter the 80s. People that belong to the Generation Y, also called the Millennials, didn't actually enjoy the Nigeria of 80s because they were still young by the time. But despite the Structural Adjustment Program, the SAP, that was implemented by the IBB regime, the 80s wasn't bad at all in terms of the economy compared to what is happening today. But compared to Nigeria of the 70s, the 80s was actually bad in terms of economy, exchange rate, and many things. In fact, the mid-80s saw the first time Nigerians imported used vehicle, otherwise called Tokumbo or Belgium at the time. Cars that were in vogue at the time, Peugeot 504, GL, GR, and L that was manufactured in the 70s, Then you have the Mercedes 230E, the flat boot as it was called, the Catface, then the V-boot. All these models, Nigerians started importing them from Europe because of the devaluation of the Naira, which of course was a result of the SAP policy that was introduced by the IBB regime. By the late 80s, things have started getting too bad to the extent that Nigerians started to move abroad to go and live, not to go on tourism or visit family or anything. They started living en masse to go and work there and come back to Nigeria because of the exchange rate. The Nigerian exchange rate at the time and the value of the Naira has started to fall to the extent that people saw it as being valueless. They never knew that there would be a time that Naira will exchange for 1,300 and something Naira to $1. Also in the late 80s, many foreigners started withdrawing from Nigerian universities because it didn't make sense to them. Why are they schooling in the country when their people are trooping into their own countries to work? So they started moving to other countries, Europe, America, even some West African countries to study because they felt that everything was falling apart in Nigeria. With all the political pressure on the IBB regime in the late 80s to quickly finalize a transition to democracy, they eventually yielded and held an election in 1993. Of course, they eventually annulled the result of that election. All that happened at the time, from the transition program to the annulment of the presidential election and to Abacha taking over on November 17th, 1993, all that hit the Nigerian economy and the value of the Naira so hard. Of course, it was still child's play compared to what we have today. Before we continue the analysis to the present day, it is important to know that one generation of Nigerians, that's the baby boomers generations, they've been in charge since the 70s, 80s, 90s till this present day. They've refused to let go. So practically this generation is responsible for mismanagement of our first oil boom in the 70s. All the technocrats that work with the military government of the time, they are all responsible. Many of them are still in government till today. They mismanaged that revenue. They couldn't bring back the economy to where it was in the 70s. From the 80s, 90s, 2000s till today, it has all been decline to the bottomless pit. Now, back to the 90s, some millennials that experienced the 90s a bit might take the 90s as the golden year of Nigeria because of the stability we had, especially the Naira exchange rate to the dollar. It was stable for about 5 years during Abacha's reign. Even inflation was at least a bit manageable. Goods weren't expensive, transportation. We still had many countries to go on free visa in the 90s. Yes, even up to 2000s. There were still countries Nigerians could visit without a visa. Now, to the turn of the century, in the early 2000s, all the mismanagement from the 70s, 80s, and 90s all piled up. In the 70s, no one thought about the Nigerian population explosion, that the electric power requirements will double in the early 2000s. No one thought about all this. No one thought about investing in the future that will require more homes, require wider expressways, require pipe-borne water, many things. No one thought about them. So they all piled up. The Obasanjo administration actually started building power plants that no one built for the past nearly 40 years. Yes, it's not as if Nigerians didn't experience power cuts in the 70s, but they were rare, comparable to West African countries. But because there was no improvement, they didn't think about the future. They didn't expand it by the time someone said our problem is not money, but how to spend it. If they had taken into account that the Nigerian population will grow into the hundreds of millions, they would have invested in the future, or at least invested it into a sovereign trust fund like Norway and Saudi Arabia. All that they didn't do. Now, the early 2000s also saw the introduction of GSM on a massive scale into the Nigerian market. This came nearly a decade after a former Minister of Communications, of course he belongs to the baby boomers generation, he said that telephone is not meant for the poor. All these will sound like fantasies and stories to the young Nigerians who belong to the Generation Z. They all grew up and saw their parents and brothers using telephones. They didn't know how it came about that despite Nigeria being the giant of Africa, that we were late to the party. Many small African countries already had GSM in the 90s. It was widely used in Cotonou in nearby Benin Republic. So that's to tell you how short-sighted and selfish the baby boomers generation are. Of course, not all of them, but a greater percentage of people who have plunged Nigeria into where we are today belong to the baby boomers generation. Now, let's make some comparisons with Nigeria of today and just a decade ago, 2011, 2013, and 2014. About a decade ago, you could take a 1 hour flight for about 10,000 naira. Today, it's about 100 and something thousand naira. No need going over the high cost of living in Nigeria, but it's important to know that Nigeria has become more expensive than Europe. Yes, this is not even debatable. Groceries worth 100 euros that can serve a small family for 1 month cannot be gotten in Nigeria for double the amount, about 300,000 naira worth of groceries in Nigeria. Maybe it might be enough for 1 month, which leads one to question why are things so expensive in a third world country? It's not supposed to be so. Yes, because the demographics is different from Europe. You have more poor people in Nigeria. That means the poor people cannot afford majority of what is available in the market. They can afford the high cost of living. This brings us to the role young Nigerians will play in the Nigerian project going forward. You can agree that it is practically impossible to get Nigeria back to the golden years without fighting for it. When people who experienced Nigeria of the golden years continue to fight to get it back to that time, your job is to support them or do nothing instead of opposing them, because they are actually fighting for your future, because you are the younger ones, you are the ones that will live longer than them. Even as at the 80s, when Nigerians traveled abroad for the first time, many of them shed tears because they thought that Nigerian development was all that could be obtainable in the world. They didn't know that many countries were far developed than Nigeria. This happens to the young generation of today. Most of them think that movies are just movies, that these are film tricks, that the environment doesn't exist in reality. When they go abroad, they will see, hey, are these people living on earth with Nigerians? Why is Nigeria not developed as this? Despite all the earnings, the billions of dollars earned in revenue over the past 40 years, what did they do with all the money? So we all know that many Generation Z are working for the baby boomers. These are the people that defend them, both online and offline. They do that for a fee. They are paid monthly, which is like mortgaging their future, because the baby boomers generation are busy obtaining loans that will be repaid in 50 years' time. Let that sink in. Buhari printed 23 trillion naira. No one can identify where the money was invested in, or did they use all that money to pay salaries? So the time is not tomorrow or next year, the time is now. If you cannot do anything to fight for your future, do not discourage anyone that is fighting for your own future. Thanks for watching.